Um, so I want to talk to you about this writing project that I sent you a piece of a project that I called Air. Uh, but what I want to talk about sort of connects that project to a new one that I'm just starting to work on. That is going to be about levitation. So which is why I've titled this "The Air People," and that I'm interested in the materials, the materiality of air, but particularly how we inhabit the air, and especially the ways in which that relationship has been expressed in different kinds of cultural forms, and maybe literature is one of those. So I'm going to draw on an excerpt from Air that I didn't send you, and some small parts of the new project that I'm writing at the moment, and I'm planning to write next year, and the next couple of years, on levitation. So what does this have to do with mobility? What does air have to do with mobility? Might it have to do with flow? And what might this have to do with literature? Well, I suppose the air people I want to talk about reflect a relationship between the air and mobility, and I want to take this relationship seriously. I want to think about how cultures of mobility, how meanings of mobility, how experiences and sensations of mobility, which are the kinds of things that geographers, sociologists, writers within cultural studies and beyond have been thinking about in what's being called a new mobilities paradigm or mobility studies that's kind of orbited around the work of Brightest Light John Arry and many others. I want to ask how these issues interfere with the air, especially in mobilities which take subjects to the air, but not only to fly. So I'm interested in a more phenomenological sense of being enfolded in the air. So in other words, and I think it was interesting because Erica was talking about the sky and the earth earlier on today, and one of the things I'm interested in is not just to see the air or the atmosphere as something up there or out there, but something that is down here with us. So in a sense of thinking about us as inhabitants of the earth, not ex-habitants of the earth. And this is a distinction that Tim Ingold has made about the weather. And he sort of writes about that a lot of the ways that we conceive of our relationship with the air or with the atmosphere. If you think of a sort of, he uses the example of a child drawing where they are on the world, and they draw a sphere, and then they draw a stick on top of a stick man on top of the sphere, and then they draw clouds above the sphere and the stick man. So the air is kind of separate from us in those sorts of imaginations. But what if we were to think about the air and the atmosphere as something we're enfolded within, that breathes, that moves through us constantly? And what ways then are those kinds of relationships expressed? So, I mean, we could look at art, and I pick up on art and creative practices in the book, but there are also other kinds of expressions, and I want to touch on, and I appreciate that my relationship with literature is not necessarily a deep one. So I will sort of be touching on different kinds of writing that have inspired me, but there might be much deeper questions to ask of that. Also, I'm going to be dealing with some concepts today that are not going to be made. They're not going to be very explicit. They're more implicit. So the intended readership for these projects is a more general audience. So I think you'll be able to pick holes and find problems with this, and I hope we can talk about some of that within the discussion. Okay, so I want to structure the rest of the talk or focus on two things. So the first relationship between mobility and air that I'm going to look at is through travel and travel writing in particular. From the 19th century into the 20th century, and this is going to come from a particular kind of Anglo-Saxon tradition. I appreciate that. And the second one is going to be focused on verticality. So I'm interested in bodies and people that have been taken up into the air through buildings or flight or in other forms. So first travel, and then the vertical, and that's how I'll structure the rest of this talk. Okay, so travel. So in the marketplaces of 1850s Cairo or Baghdad, bazaars and cafes of a special kind of oriental air are to be found, unfamiliar and alien to Western explorers, quite magical. The airs are seducing and enthralling. Whilst in 1832 Europe's newsreaders learn of a Madras Brahmin who sat in the air levitating, the air of the Oriental city worries its visitors with exposure to the thrill of a steamy air tipping over into insalubrious, unwholesome danger. In these sorts of terms, writers like de Gerville visiting New Egypt perfectly illustrate a kind of toing and froing between the air's seductive affectations that quickly begin to sicken. So the important encounter here I want to tease out of is the relationship or the meeting between airs and genders, because nothing disturbed Oriental atmospheres quite like women. So in the travel writers I'm interested in, they excavate movements of bodies, hips, sweat, perfume, hair and voice that come to permeate the air of the Oriental city. Jean-Léon Gérôme's The Dance of the Alma is a classic representation expressing much of the desire and sexuality present within these sorts of atmospheres. So we see and we read representations of belly dancers moving with titillating excitement, gyrating, their flesh quivering, the scent of their bodies in the air, their harsh cries joined to wild music. So movement in these passages seems to create a particular kind of air or atmosphere around it. De Gerville's description comes from a particular encounter. He had been led by a donkey farmer into a house near the market and sat on a stool in a chamber lit by 2 smoky lamps. Charmed by 3 women who advanced, retired, returned, he was soon overcome. In these early travel logs, air seems to be a kind of projection, a geographical imagination of the far off that gets materialised in text and image, primarily for mediation, so to be read back somewhere else, to be read back perhaps in London or Paris, where, for instance, Charles Baudelaire would feel the pull of an air fragrant with desire, so he's sort of almost being pulled towards these imaginations. Baudelaire breathes the warm scent and sees the invitation of shorelines spreading out. The exotic fragrance leads as if a hand gently tugging one forward. Verdant tamarind's enchanting scent fills his nostril and swells his brain. So in some of these writings, we almost find a sort of kind of mobility impulse through these tales of air. But perhaps not to be trusted fully, the titillating air of the Orient is almost that of a harpy's call. So in Baudelaire's poem Head of Air, flowing hair becomes an atmospheric mixture of materials, of air and perfume and spirit and seduction. A hemisphere of hair is the other title of Baudelaire's poetry in Paris Spleen. Like the air of hair in The Flowers of Evil, he cements the sense that the ethereal aroma is a transported space of movement. So he's characterising this experience as if almost being taken away, carried away on a ship, carried away to sweeter climates, to blue, where the air is sweet. Now, airy accounts through gender are not anything new in Europe at this time. In fact, we see other gendered imaginations of smell and air in the figure of the female witch. The airs of the witch are transgressive. I don't know if that translates, by the way. Does witch translate? Yeah. I'll sort of keep on going and see what you think. So the airs of the witch are transgressive. Their speech expresses thoughts and feelings in contrast to the fasting from speech that was considered more appropriate for women. Witches would seduce with their melodic words but could cause trouble by their meaning. They possessed a keen sense of smell, characteristics known to anyone familiar with Germanic storytelling, or this substantial involution through children's writers such as Roald Dahl. I don't know if Roald Dahl's The Witches has translated. So in command of stewing and boiling liquids and vapours, witches were believed to discharge foul airs, foul odours, infecting their surroundings and those nearby, and they could even control the elements, and that's where my interest in levitation again comes in, although I'll get to it later. They could fly, on broomsticks perhaps. So the witch seems a century inverse of other kinds of figures, like the female saint, although we also know that female saints could also levitate in ecstasy, who is almost idealised as an ideal figure, but restricted by fasting and celibacy, whilst the witch aspires to male authority and a gluttony of sins. So compare this then to the encounters with Cairo or Baghdad that I've been drawing on. In the late 19th century, we find that the travel writers' sensual excitability at this new air that they're finding cools off. Renderings of exotic women begin to solidify, and the air takes shape, perhaps in forms of fat, held as putrid skin and wobble in wretched bodies, anxious for the coin of a Western visitor. Well, this is the way it's rendered in these travel logs. In Cairo, even de Gerville's testimony poses the Oriental body as a pleasant impression, but only temporarily, the exception to the rule of a revolting nakedness. Elsewhere, he describes a woman mounted on a donkey whose form disappears under her flesh. Now, Eustace Reynolds Bull 1857 account of Cairo is probably most interesting in the way it investigates several important mixtures of air or atmosphere that become comparable with Walter Benjamin's ideas around aura. So see what you think about this. Reynolds Bull analyses the displays of women dancers at local cafes, what she calls a substratum of Oriental life and atmosphere formed through the endless gyrations of a stout young woman of unprepossessing features. The dancer's movements are endlessly and tirelessly repeated as another girl who goes through the same motions then takes up her place. Now, what Reynolds Bull is trying to articulate or highlight are the efforts of a number of artists attempting to assimilate place into product, but she cannot help but compare the atmosphere of the places with the first works to have come out of the Orient. So it's almost as if these travel logs, these tales, are becoming over-repeated and they're getting overexposed. So already exposed to Western mediation and intervention, the local colour and air of Cairo could only suffer ruination by enterprising Greeks and Levantines who were managing the dances for European visitors and producing what Reynolds Bull describes as ordinary a display as any cafe in Antwerp or Amsterdam. So she's saying she can find these cultural expressions anywhere. The local artists lack the aptitude for anything that Bull describes as striking or any quality of originality or freshness, she argues. And so, like Walter Benjamin's description of the spark of contingency, the magical value of what he considers an authentic presence, the positive values of Oriental air or aura are seen to be declining through their reproduction, through the reproduction of these acts. And so, well familiar with the picture exhibitions of Cairo's interiors and their street scenes, visitors like Bull are disappointed. They're disappointed at what she calls a painfully modern-looking city that could be mistaken for anywhere else. Something about them is being lost. Some aura and some atmosphere is no longer there. Now, these sentiments were not only reserved for the atmospheres of moving women with sashaying bodies, but men's too. Constant Gordon Cummings captures some of this sense of awe and disgust at the moving, sweating, foaming and filthy bodies of the whirling dervishes she witnessed. Her descriptions see the groups swaying from side to side, to and fro, their bodies rolling and groaning out. And then suddenly, with violent, spasmodic jerks, the men were dashing themselves backwards and forwards, touching the ground with their hands, their wildly dishevelled hair again, tossing back right in our faces. So Reynolds Bull has a different spin on the twirling dervishes, whose motion has the air of a genuine mystic and later the air of the wonder-seer. Something happens in the tumultuous space between dervish and spectator, as if a drug. This perhaps is a purer, apparently more authentic Oriental encounter with air. So one of the things we might consider then is sort of what is the relationship between air and bodies, and what kind of air or atmosphere do bodies produce around themselves? Could we think about air or atmosphere as a kind of atmospheric affect, as something that is more than representational, something that we struggle to try to capture, and perhaps air or atmosphere are the only words that we've really got within our vocabulary? But undoubtedly Reynolds Bull is talking about other kinds of air, so not just the air of bodies and the air of these encounters, but because she is quite a fussy inspector of Cairo's atmospheric charms and vices, we shouldn't forget that she was already a distinguished expert on air and its moral and physiological qualities. So air at this time, when we look at different understandings of air at this moment, air is associated with morality, with wholesomeness, with salubrity. and this builds on a longer history of thinking about and trying to test the air for these kinds of moral qualities. Indeed, the writer we're talking about was known for her writing on the health resorts of Europe, and perhaps the beginning of her book, The City of the Caliphs, is as good an indicator as any of her concern for salubrious airs. The opening lines to her book describes Cairo's airs from Arabian Nights as soft, its odours surpassing that of aloe wood and cheering the heart. So there's, in other words, there's something more to air that we might get at within these kinds of passages. There's something potent to air. There's something about air that is emotive, that is instinctive, but also something, it contains particular moral qualities that are being written about disdainfully or not by these writers. Okay, so let's turn back to Europe and move from Egypt to the Victorian health resorts to other places of travel of Brighton, Scarborough and Blackpool that would entice other 19th century writers with different kinds of qualities, not their insalubrity, but restorative qualities of the salty sea air. These places would later become the context for the sexual frisson of marital affairs and the carnival qualities of a liminal zone. So there's some literature within geography that looks at the kind of cultural history of seaside resorts like Blackpool and thinks about them as liminal spaces. So sort of somewhere at the border zones between the sea, the beach, and the land. And writers like Rob Shields, who wrote a classic book in the early 90s called Places on the Margin, sort of explores the relationship between these liminal spaces and liminal carnival kinds of qualities where anything goes. So not just a literal border, but a metaphorical social borderland too, where our inhibitions seem to be released when we visit these kinds of places. And Blackpool and Brighton in the UK became quite famous for this. In fact, you might know some of Mikhail Bakhtin's work, who writes about the carnivalesque and the grotesque. These are kind of encounters that you might see in these places. But that's perhaps their more recent history. Because as oases of health, these places could also be a chance for reflection as well as rejuvenation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a place called Cromer, which is on the North Norfolk coast of England. And Elizabeth Gaskell, the famous writer, her character Margaret Hale, who would seek bodily strengthening upon the death of her parents and family friend in the book North and South. Now for writer Wendy Parkins, what we see in Hale and in North and South is an emerging form of mobility that perhaps we haven't seen before. An emerging autonomy and independence of women taking advantage of the Victorian railways that are extending their way to these seaside resorts for the right kind of air, pulled in by the good air. Margaret, now tragically relinquished of her father and mother, goes to Cromer, and there by the sea she's there for rejuvenation, for reflection. The sea air, its breeze, and other characters move about her, and there's quite a famous scene of her sitting on the beach. Margaret is there for the curing of mind as much as body, but hers is not a passive submission to the air, and we'll come to this. I should also say that places like Cromer also became really important for other sorts of restorative therapy, particularly for the curing of tuberculosis. There's lots of sanatoriums that would expose patients to air cures, to air immersion, to light and air. So this sort of moral restoration became associated with a physical, medical restoration too. Other women began to emulate Hale's motion to Cromer. Women would walk in Brighton and other seaside towns designed with high society promenades, the purpose of which was to breathe the sea air and its breezes. The building work of esplanades, promenades, jetties, piers and terraces, in effect other spatial and architectural formations that began to spring up around seaside places, drew on copies from the Mediterranean, from places like Venice, and especially the marina at Palermo. Signs of women's increasing freedoms were extended by the provision of these cool airs and the shelter of a shade. No husband, it was said, would dream of forbidding his wife to walk at night in the shade of the marina. Social anonymity and mixing was also possible in the late evening, as the mariners would allow social separation to blur through the confused cloaking of identity in the fading light. So there's a curious relationship between air and light, I think, going on here that I'll tease out a little bit more later. But North and South is a book full of air and atmospheres which foretell of a particular Western modernity, while expressing a wider societal concern for a particular kind of bad air, which we might have seen earlier on in our travel logs of Cairo and elsewhere. Or even the humoral temperament of melancholy, which Robert Burton would explore in his 1652 unbelievable book. If you ever have the chance to, you can download it, The Anatomy of Melancholy. I recommend it, if you have the time, because it's huge. So melancholy was a temperament that would commonly affect the literate and artistic classes. Its airs appear thick, cloggy, foggy and impure. Melancholy expresses an air of a dejected spirit, an infection by the heart. Melancholic air attacks from within and from without, and such is the kinds of air which plague Margaret before she goes to Cromer. Melancholic airs immerse her, and they express her moods. They suffocate her and her mother with dampness. So again, just to sort of come back to what we're teasing out, what is the relationship between our airs and atmospheres, things that exude, that move out of us and surround us, or are they the things and qualities we find as we move into different places? But there are also airs that Margaret eventually confronts, and through that process restores herself. So in Cromer, we've already said, Margaret takes the air for her own, but early in the book, in Milton particularly, she battles it, and how does she? So at first, Margaret's relation to the air is indifference, or rather earlier in the novel, her attitude is an easy one. She's as variable as the light breeze, and in some respects, Margaret is a kind of air earlier in the book. Margaret bathes in the environment of her childhood home in the south of England, in Helston. She lives in a pragmatic and ignorant state of the apprehensions and the fears and worries of those around her. So this is a more kind of innocent air, perhaps she hasn't yet grown up. And any internal dissonance is quickly forgotten by a sunny day, so her mood seems to blow as quickly as the wind. But this soon changes as her situation is radically transformed. Her father leaves his role as a minister for a position in the north of England, in Milton and in the fictional county Berkshire. So Berkshire is standing in for places of industry, particularly Lancashire, which was home to the cotton industry. So the winds of change in this part of the book set up an inevitability. There's something quite fatalistic about these encounters with air. Unpacking the house into the rented accommodation they take at first outside this northern town in Milton, Margaret sees a thick fog surrounding the house. This fog is said to creep with searching fingers, feeling their way into the house through the windows in white, unwholesome mists. So, okay, I'm going to read, this is quite not lengthy, but it's a passage from the book. I won't do the voices. So, "Oh, Margaret, are we to live here?" asked Mrs. Hale, this is Margaret's mother, in blank dismay. Margaret's heart echoed the dreariness of the tone in which this question was put. She could scarcely command herself enough to say, "Oh, the fogs in London are sometimes far worse," trying to placate her mother. "But then you knew that London itself and friends lay behind it. Here, well, we are desolate. Oh, Dixon, that's their servant. What a place this is." "Indeed, ma'am, I'm sure it will be your death before long, and then I know who'll stay." There was no comfort to be given. They were settled in Milton and must endure smoke and fogs for a season. Indeed, all other life seemed shut out from them, as if by as thick a fog of circumstance. So sort of air again is being used to talk about something out, so sort of fatalistic sense of air. The air is becoming a way of describing the circumstances within which they find themselves. And again, mobility is right at the heart of this tale. They've been forced to move northwards. And things only get worse. So Margaret's stupor is temporarily suspended by their movement out of the fog to the smoke and grimy landscape of Milton. So they first moved just outside Milton, and now they're moving into the city. But these airs appear a bit different to the fogs of the countryside. These airs are more noble and quite unlike the damp and more soulful qualities of the semi-rural mists which insist worry upon them. But unfortunately Mrs. Hale soon succumbs to some respiratory disease, reflecting the pale, fatalistic way tuberculosis was understood. And if you look at Susan Sontag's book on illness and metaphor, draws out these sorts of ideas. In the lead up to her death, Margaret's mother tries to hide her illness as a secret. She believes that her death is certain, and there's no point in talking about it. And in fact, she's just assuming that her symptoms will get worse. At this stage, it is women who appear extremely sensitive to air, so both Margaret and her mother fluttering like a flag in the breeze, while it is men, so very gendered senses of air again going on here, while it is men who are set against the wind. So take the mill owner, Mr. Thornton, who battles the elements, and he seems to move in spite of them, despite the air itself. When it is announced that Mr. Thornton, doing a very English thing, is coming to tea, when it's announced that he's coming, Mrs. Hale, Margaret's mother, fatalistically announces, "But east or west wind, I suppose this man comes." And Mrs. Hale and Margaret can only wonder then at the man's indifference to the weather. The more it rains and blows, the more certain we are to have them, I suspect. But just like Mr. Thornton, Margaret's story is one of learning to confront the air. So we see this as labour relations in Milton break down. So we have an industrial dispute in the cotton factory, in the mill. So this comes to a head as Mr. Thornton stands his ground in the factory forecourt during a dispute with the workers over their pay. And a growing mob of workers congregate to voice their dissatisfaction, and they effectively, the situation is verging on a riot. So things aren't looking good. The crowd's motion and atmosphere are buzzing with excitement. The crowd takes on the thunderous atmosphere of a storm which boils morally as well as physically around her, starting in a low, distant roar. And we might compare this very closely to the way that Dickens writes about revolution in France. Very similar adjectives, very similar words and descriptors are being used here. Once more, the turbulence builds as a volatile mixture of airs and fluids, airs almost understood as fluids or flows. First, from the slow surging wave of the dark crowd, atmospheric disturbances which force themselves on Margaret's notice. That's how Gaskell describes it. The crowd's bodies are turned into battering rams. So again, we're seeing bodies again being turned metaphorically into other things. The crowd's bodies are turned into battering rams against the gates of the mill, and the strong gates quiver like reeds before the wind. In the standoff, and losing the moment, so Margaret is there, sort of stood behind Mr. Thornton. Mr. Thornton's authority is arrested as he fails to speak. He doesn't challenge the crowd in any way. He fails to move. In fact, he's almost kind of folded up. His arms are folded. His arms are crossed as if a barrier, and his body is still, as if a statue. And this silence almost lets the raging whirlwind of the crowd free. But Margaret acts. Margaret anticipates the uproar and the possible explosion of men and boys and passions that will easily sweep before them. She sees some boys, and it's not just as if boys would have been there, but again, another quite gendered tale. She sees some boys about to give flight to their wooden shoes, so they're going to throw them as missiles towards Mr. Thornton. That Gaskell writes as if taken by the devil's opportunity to agitate their spirits. So drawing on slightly older ideas about airs and humours, so it draws on a much older idea that there are these elemental materials that are both outside and inside of our bodies, driving our temperaments, driving our spirit. So perhaps taken by the devil's opportunity, for when the humours by the air be stirred, they go with them. But Margaret rushes and steps in front of Mr. Thornton to confront the crowd, and her effect is an almost equal and opposite force. She lets out a gasp of breath, but it halts the tide, causing the atmosphere of the crowd to waver, and they stand off. And so, as Gaskell writes it, for she stood between them and their enemy, Mr. Thornton. She could not speak, but held out her arms towards them till she could recover breath. Okay, so enough of travel. So this is the last half then about the vertical. And I want to start with the idea of elevation. So Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote about his internal tempo, a spiritual metabolism which is driven by the environment around him. And he asks us to make a list. He says, make a list for yourself of all the places where intelligent people have been. These places, Paris, Florence, Provence, Jerusalem, Athens, all of them have outstandingly dry air. In fact, for Nietzsche, this is what genius depends on: clear skies that will deliver strength and vitality to one's metabolism. Nietzsche is making an argument, a curious argument, that good air does good things. His ill health would lead him to reflect on the implicit powers of recovery and restoration. As a very finely calibrated and reliable instrument, Nietzsche could easily interpret the effects of climate and meteorology on his health and his work. So he gives us a recommendation. He says, sit as little as possible, he wrote. Do not believe any idea that was not born in the open air and of free movement, in which the muscles do not also revel. It's a kind of body culture, Northern European body culture being expressed here, which takes air of a high and pure character to be the right environment for the restoration of health and well-being. Now, Baudelaire's poetics, to come back, would echo this too, describing the alpine qualities that cleanse the spirit in his elevation. And as Gaston Bachelard explores in his elaboration of Nietzsche's air, if you're interested in air and the relationship with poetics, Gaston Bachelard, one of his many different almost biographies of the elements, his writings on air are amazing. For Bachelard, there is a cultural kind of yearning to be born back to the air that Nietzsche is expressing here and that we might feel. To expand, to sort of open out into the air. The philosopher Irigaray writes about our first moment of being born as being we're made airborne as we're born, as we emerge from the womb and we take a breath for the first time. She writes about it as a sort of almost primal form of community, of being part of something bigger, something else. And in Nietzsche there's almost a similar kind of want to expand going on here. But we also see comparisons, so that high air, vertical air is good, whilst the air of the lowlands, of the city, of the canyons is contagious. So that elevation contains some kind of tonic quality of air that we need to move to, and that again encourages a lot of tourism to move to the tonic qualities of air held in the peaks of mountains or in our dreams. And so again, to turn back to some writing that I was exposed to as a child, there's no mistake perhaps in the story of Heidi, if any of you have come across that. So Johanna Spyri's famous children's book. But this book appears almost at the very same time as the air's assimilation into forms of administration of health. So in hospital and sanitation therapies and the curative architecture of the Alpine Sanatorium, his resorts would see enormous amounts of health and leisure tourism. So Davos in Switzerland was to become one of the archetypal models of Alpine design for tuberculosis patients. Its particular qualities of air and sun the benchmark for the planning of other sanatoriums located on similar climates. Designed by Carl Turban, the building was entirely about hygiene and the exposure of the patients to the qualities of air, light and sun. And so architectural historians who delve into the modern building design, modernist architecture, draw some of the historical roots to that through the sanatorium. So the later Queen Alexandra Sanatorium would take Turban's exemplar to another level of modern design. Hotels and sanatoriums appeared almost as if out of thin air, adorned with stepped balconies and sun terraces, heliotherapy, aerotherapy, the air bath, the immersion in light with some of the different medical techniques used, perfect opposites to the squalor and stagnant airs of the urban slums of Europe or North America or elsewhere. So how does all this, sort of where I want to move is into the skyscraper. How do we get there? Well, a little earlier, air and vertical living had met more silently and underground and encased as infrastructure within Birdsill Holley's steam heat system for New York. In 1881, Holley patented the first steam radiator, which gave way to other series of advances as he forged ahead with a district steam heating system for downtown Manhattan. So all of the popular images that we know of New York, where you see steam emerging from the pavement and the street, those are from late 19th century steam heat systems, some of which are still there, where steam, not water, is being circulated around the city. So the system was fed by a vast boiler topped by a 210-foot high, 32 feet across untapered chimney on Cortlandt and Washington, which became a new landmark for New York in 1882 as passers-by wondered at the workmen scrambling up the tower to complete it, so almost precursor to the skyscraper. Falling from the dizziest heights was the furthest thing from their minds, apparently. So what later became the New York Steam Company fed heat and power to New York skyscrapers and apartment buildings by an underground network of pipes conveying their steam into a hive of businesses, industries and residences. And if I just sort of pause slightly, just to mention that one of the sort of main focuses of my work and a lot of writers within this interdisciplinary body of work that calls itself New Mobilities are interested in is not just the movement of people or being transported by things, but also the movement of things too. And some of the strategies of that kind of work, so writers like Stephen Graham and Matthew Gandhi, has been to sort of delve into the things that we almost take for granted, so the encased pipes, cables, etc., that constitute modern living, infrastructure in other words, and almost things that are kind of taken for granted and haven't been explored that much critically, or haven't until relatively recently. So could it have gone unnoticed that the very powered air which gave speed to transatlantic migration by the steamers was now permitting the colonisation of New York's skies? So from the Empire State Building to the Chrysler Building to Tudor City to Radio City at the Rockefeller Center, steam heat promised all the benefits of living in the air. So a lot of these systems became concentrated on high-rise skyscrapers and apartment buildings. No boiler plants, smokestacks, apart from the one on Cortlandt, grime or exhausts. The steam tingled with the city planner's vision of air and sunlight. Steam heating meant steam ironing, and it also meant steam printing. That was one of the building logics for the development of high-rise newspaper presses. So some of the earlier skyscrapers were for the newspapers. They also fed Rockefeller's New Plaza, and first its opera, radio and later television, a perceptibly more democratic business according to the New York Times, as sunlight, air, steam and the airways came together in an efficient modern machine of circulation. That's some of the rhetoric surrounding the building of places like Rockefeller Center. But just before we get to the skyscraper, before we get there, consider another context. Consider the work, a context found in Aravind Adiga's main protagonist, Balram, in his book, The White Tiger, and contemplate the mobilities needed to navigate the city in between these high-rise locations. So moving to a contemporary context. Think about the sealed air-conditioned car Balram drives through Delhi, and how that exemplifies the escape of the middle classes from the country's problems and its poor, or at least this is a narrative told in The White Tiger. There, city air is routinely filtered, face masks are worn to avoid the pollutants. It is so bad, Balram explains, that it takes 10 years of one's life. But importantly, perhaps another characteristic of air we're getting at, this is not air for all. Air is highly unequal and distributed and differentiated. So Balram's employers avoid the air of the outside, and Balram, as their chauffeur, does too. It is just nice, cool, clean, air-conditioned air for us. The air-conditioned apartment, but especially the car, seems to stand in the book for a modern India. The many automobiles seem to Balram to resemble dark eggs, painted spheres with tinted windows bustling around the streets of Delhi. The closed and air-conditioned chambers he describes resemble accounts of the incredible congestion and air pollution of many megacities that populate the global south, causing vast respiratory problems for the inhabitants of these dense, sprawling forms. And we know, for instance, that Beijing has recently dropped its blue sky days to recognise far more comprehensive air quality measures due from air pollution. But in Balram's narrative of Delhi, the conditioned and comfortable car is a condition for ignorance, for separation, shielding its occupants from the atmospheric woes of the outside. Occasionally these eggs open up a crack. Out of the egg stretches a woman's hand, dazzling with gold bangles, but it doesn't stay there for long. The window goes up and the egg is released. Perhaps the car and these air-conditioned climates articulate the fragmented lives of the city. The controlled climate is protection from the fumes and wisps of exhausts, the fog of petrol and tobacco, which hides a bureaucracy corrupted by bought officials in a murky world of half-light. So in this auto-mobility, Balram writes, of clean, purer air, we were like separate cities, inside and outside the dark egg. Maybe India's Mahindra Corporation's desirable 4x4 Bolero is the extreme fulfilment of Balram's commentary. Google it and have a look at these cars. The car is all about separation, it's all about muscularity and presence, but also a sort of form of absence from the road. Or look at Tata's Nano, is perhaps maybe a more apt example of the tiny eggs that Balram is characterising. The small car selling for less than $2,000, or is proposed. So they both illustrate the tendency towards the appropriation of the road and public space with a personalised and fortified air. So in other words, air is not something that's shared, it's something that can be sealed up like a fortress. Tinted windows and sealed up spaces even signal social status. But perhaps the reason, and sorry this might ruin the book a little bit if you haven't read it, the reason Balram murders his employer outside the car as he checks the wheel is because the internal space of the egg, its plastic fittings and nylon seat-coloured cushions and its purified air have become so desirable to him they've almost become sacred. And so he uses the tyre iron he's going to use to change the wheel as his weapon of choice as he smashes in his master's skull. Okay, so everything's going to get a little bit dark for a moment before we get to the end of this. Bear with me. So perhaps Balram's city is India's answer to 1980s Manhattan, back to skyscrapers, which would set the scene for the ludicrous heights of financial services, the ultimate ultra-excesses of consumer capital, and the indifferent lives of the super-rich yuppies who inhabited this world of air-conditioned apartments and office buildings. And I'm going to draw on a particular genre or particular sort of micro-genre of fiction I think you can see in late 1980s New York. So these are the new atmospheric natures of manufactured air in the city. Architectural historian David Gisson this is how he christens this world, these sub-natures, atmospheric natures, which for him have dramatically arisen since the invention of the air conditioner and other technological changes in the 1960s. The clean, dry air of the air conditioning unit taunts a particular character I want to dwell on. And that is Bret Easton Ellis's deranged psychopathic New York banker, Patrick Bateman, in his 1991 novel, American Psycho. So Bateman is an evil but somehow sympathetic figure in the business not of mergers and acquisitions but murders and executions. In amongst Bateman's multiple-page diatribes on 1980s music icons I think none of you are old enough to know, like Genesis and Huey Lewis and the News, is a real sense of distance in a society all but vacated of levity and responsibility. So again, air is not for all, but it also seems to signify this apartness from everyone else. Possibly the most poignant and pathetic scene happens when Bateman creeps into the men's toilets at the Yale Club. You must see the movie as well that came out, I don't know, about a decade ago. Bateman creeps into the men's toilets at the Yale Club to strangle his colleague, Lewis Carruthers. So I'm going to describe the scene. In slow motion, my own heavy breathing, this is a quote from the book, blocking out all other sounds, my vision blurring slightly around the edges, my hands move up over the collar of his cashmere blazer and cotton flannel shirt, circling his neck until my thumbs meet at the nape and my index fingers touch each other just above Lewis's Adam's apple. But Lewis has mistaken Patrick's attempt at murder for an act of love, and Patrick is paralysed and choked. He tries to squeeze the breath out of Lewis with even more force, imagining his trachea squashed and crumbling, but it is Patrick's own air which falters. The soap bubble world of lofty separation, encapsulating boxes of apartments and elevators, the temporary castles in the air are shattered in this moment of touch in the space of a toilet cubicle. All barriers broken, Bateman cannot murder, and nor can he breathe. But Bateman, I think, stands for something wider, perhaps an amplification of figures seen in the likes of Tom Wolfe's 1987 Bonfire of the Vanities, also turned into a movie, and the kind of vertical and air-conditioned society Jonathan Rabin would call Manhattan's Air People, where I got the title for this talk from, in his 1991 book, Hunting Mr. Heartbreak. So these three novels, these three books, written and published within a few years of each other, Bonfire, American Psycho, and Hunting Mr. Heartbreak, seem to be stunning critiques of air of a certain kind, and the people who inhabit those airs. The air people of this world are the society of identikit Wall Street bankers, financial workers who inhabit an ethereal but not monotonous vertical world, taking author of Charlotte's Web, E.B. White's notion of an insulated and ventilated urbanity to its ultimate end. Rather than, although White was writing in another context, I should say, or an earlier context of New York, White was explicitly responding to the building of the UN headquarters at that time. But rather than ride the subways that brought White side by side a famous actor, atmospheric insulation is the organising principle for Tom Wolfe's banker and master of the universe, Tom Wolfe's Sherman. And you might see the Wolf of Wall Street that is sort of a contemporary resonance with this. That was the ticket. Insulation, Sherman learns. You've got to insulate, 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 his father tells him. Sherman lives, just like Bateman and others, a defensible life lived at high altitude, where the old Manhattan of streets and squares is defended by security and surveillance systems. Each inhabitant we might think of almost as a balloonist, that's how Rabin describes them, floating high over the lawless wreckage of the city. So it's almost a life with no connection to the ground below. As Bateman daydreams murderous fantasies, Rabin finds it impossible to find sense in the Park Avenue apartments, utterly divorced from the ground below he finds himself in. Rabin's inner thoughts come dangerously close to Bateman's, but murder is not what he has in mind. Rather, he is responding to recent news reports, but like Bateman, no one seems to notice his thoughts or the concerns of everyday life on the ground. So that the literal vertical existence of this new financial and social elite supports their insulation from the matters of real life, which are moving maddeningly further apart, becoming less and less held together by the umbilical of the elevators that connect them. So as Rabin concludes, up here we're sailing through the sky where the air is keen and the view is of a flawless sweep of luminous indigo blue. You're way below the cloud ceiling. You're not even a dot to us, buddy. So we're looking down at this world below. The apparent atmosphere of protection, or perhaps even refuge, which is now another narrative seen in some of these works, apes the conditioning of city life, an increasing number of Manhattan spaces that are climatically controlled for the purposes of preserving not only priceless people, but priceless objects and cultural artefacts. And this is some of where David Gisson, the historian I mentioned earlier, draws some of his work. So Gisson's incredible book, he's just published a book called Manhattan Atmospheres that traces this sort of emergence of the partitioning of controlled air in the air in New York, And he draws some of this back to the building of the building that would house the Denda Temple that was moved from the banks of the Nile to the Metropolitan Museum of Art's purpose-built hydrographically controlled building. Some of you have been there, might have seen it. The air of this inner space is a protection from the turbulence and pollution of outside, and for Gisson, that marked quite a step change in climatically controlled buildings. The American psycho, Bateman, also perceives this outside to be unwholesome, full of decay, putrid atmospheres oozing from the bodies on the pavements, so it's this architecture that protects him. The wind that shoots up and down the city's canyons of concrete and stone smells of burning chestnuts mingling with carbon monoxide. He realises that there is nothing inside him. There is only order, a perfection that seeks to reproduce outwardly in his multiple fitness, health and facial routines, an immaculate taste in the air people's uniform of Ralph Lauren polo sweaters, Valentino suits and other designer labels. So in Bateman's narrative to the reader, he is a vacuum, he is a crater, a desert, his landscape, his inside, a landscape of purity and abstraction. So, whilst in Bonfire of the Vanities, our other master of the universe, Sherman, his story has an Icarian fall, an Icarian arc. His fall sees his personal cavity, similar kind of descriptions about him and his personal body and his life, are entered as his misdemeanours go public. He can't keep the inquiring out any longer. In an elevator, death is the only option he contemplates to rid himself of the intruders of nosy neighbours poking in on his affairs. He could keep them out only in the same manner that he could deny air to his lungs once and for all. But of course, and this is where I'm sort of leaping in some of my ongoing work and future work, there are other traditions in fiction about New York's air people. For instance, we might turn to Jewish literature in the figure of the Luftmensch, a sometimes derogatory figuration of a rootless figure, suspended, airy, and intellectual. 1980s New York again situates this figure within the fortress of light found in Cynthia Ozick's short story Levitation, that I'm just going to mention briefly. At a dinner party, everything goes topsy-turvy. The rooms of the two writers' apartment shines, glinting of the glare of glasses and candles. Materials and conversations seem to shimmer in the air, afloat in the eddies. So there's a curious relationship coming back to what is the relation between light and air, or air and light. If we were to think about light as having other kinds of material qualities, as in like a lightness or heaviness to it, not just a luminosity. In the empty fireplace, a newspaper log is lit, dying quickly. The talk moves to a Holocaust survivor describing a death camp, and everything changes. The room begins to lift up. It ascends. It rises like an arc on waters, and it seems to Lucy that the room was levitating on the little grains of the refugees' whisper. They were being kidnapped, these Jews, by a messenger from the land of the dead, and the room was ascending, and it grew smaller and smaller and more remote, and she craned after it, a glory of their martyrdom. So as I move into this new project, drawing on examples like this, about the levitators, about aerial figures that seem to rise without support, and perhaps sometimes without even will, I'm struck on one side to the levitator as almost a pre or parallel history of being above, of perhaps even aviation, that we might dig into, that we perhaps haven't taken seriously within the spiritual, even scientific, even legal imagination. That's one thing I want to explore. But I also want to try to position the levitator as a different kind of air person, sat perhaps between two contradictory forces. And I'm drawing here on Italo Calvino's identification of two tendencies that he surmises dominate contemporary literature. So on the one hand, Calvino identifies a kind of weight, density and concreteness of things, bodies and sensations, and on the other, a weightlessness element that hovers above things like a cloud, or better perhaps the finest dust, or better still, the field of magnetic impulses. And to be honest, I don't know yet enough about this world to take Calvino at his word, if you like. So but what I'm interested in is exploring the position that he's taking. And what I want to suggest really is the levitator to me seems more ambivalent in this. So I'm wondering whether the levitator sits, at least in the way the levitator gets expressed within literature, is somewhere between these two tendencies to me. Not purely weightless and not purely held down either. Indeed, for me, what seems to hold the levitator suspended are ambivalent forces, somewhere between these tendencies. And so I want to just close by drawing on yet another example, and this time levitation as a trope for a sense or feeling of ambivalence. And to do that, I'm going to draw on quite a mesmerising book, Changing Heaven by Jane Urquhart. And I'll just do that for the next couple of minutes and I'll end. So when you're lighter than air, Ariana said, settling herself into a corner made by the intersection of two stone walls, then a house can weigh you down in a pleasant way, so that you don't float away altogether. I suppose, said Emily doubtfully. And if possible, there would have to be two houses for us, one for the balloon, you see, a balloon house. Now this is the conversation Urquhart narrates between the two ghosts. One, the character Ariana, dead, but known by her celebrity name as Ariana Ether, and the ghost of Emily Bronte. Now, Ariana was a female balloonist, touring the country with her domineering manager and also lover, Jeremy, performing balloon flights and parachute jumps from it. And Urquhart is drawing on an actual parachutist many years before, where there was a controversy over how this parachutist died. In the early, a balloonist who would parachute from a balloon, I should make clear. In the early parts of the novel, the balloon provides metaphors from which Ariana's myth is built, but also through which she appears subjugated to the force of her partner. So Jeremy was once her partner, and manager was once just as famous as Ariana, and known as the Sinbad of the air, but is now jealous of Ariana's success. Of course, late 19th and early 20th century levitations commonly gendered the female floating assistant in magic. So I'm thinking here about the way that the male magician's gaze and direction are often direct their assistant, who in early forms of magician where levitation would occur, that assistant was almost certainly a woman. And Polly, or Ariana, does not entirely disrupt this kind of relation as a female parachutist. As Ariana, she appears bodily almost weightless. The wind, as she arrives in Haworth, Yorkshire, threatens to carry her away. She is described as being tall and thin, with fine white, silky, curly hair. There are rumours that she had levitated even in the cradle, so lighter than air she had been from the beginning that her mother had to use blankets secured by large stones merely to confine her to her bassinet. It was said that iron shoes were made especially for her, for use when she played as a child, were she to become too animated she might float away. When she slept, her parents did not dare leave the window open a crack, should she float away through the smallest opening. She chose not to read much at all, because as she perceived it, the only function of a book would be to weigh you down, if you happened, for whatever reason, to be feeling lighter than air. So Ariana seems to have some of the qualities, almost of a balloon, but I want to suggest that these are quite ambivalent qualities. Her tethering to Jeremy is tortuous, his affection for her as changeable as the weather, as their love a rough sea, an elemental tumult of air and water she fears, and she's eventually killed, drowned by water. Ariana is subjected to masculine representations that inscribe her with a vulnerability and a frailty that justify their projection of her. Equally, her flight is rendered within a Neoplatonic and Christian tradition, which sees her ascent within the balloon as if the soul's desire to rise to the heavens to join with God and perhaps to return purified. Before her flight in Haworth, Jeremy prepares the crowd for the feat. So he says, "And so, my young friends, what you are about to see is not simply a young, pretty woman sailing away in a balloon. Oh no, no indeed. What you are about to see is the very spirit of British womanhood ascending to her rightful place with the angels in the clouds, remote, untouchable, apart. Who are these women who help us after all, if not angels? Should they not be given the power to fly like other angels? And if that is possible for all, should not there be one who can represent the rest? So Ariana's levity, or lack of, is thus a highly gendered one, her lightness signalling how out of place she is on the ground, or made out of place by her partner. She is a superfluity, while her fall, as much of her ascent, is supposed to illustrate her innate lightness. As Jeremy explains, Ariana Ether has chosen to perform this task to ascend like an angel to heaven, and then, with the aid of this wonder of modern invention, the parachute, to float sylph-like back to earth again in order to demonstrate the absolute purity, the lightness of this cleansed female soul. We could call this, Jeremy suggested, the apotheosis of Ariana. So somehow then, Ariana holds together a far more ambivalent lightness than her or the balloon being seen as the product of opposing, or rather can we see her as the product of opposing and contradictory forces, pulling her up and pulling her down. And indeed we never know, is her death accidental or does she choose death? And so really that's where I want to leave it. I want to leave us there with the air people or the air person brought back down to earth. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, for this speech. We're listening to you, and now I think I did everything that in literature. Finally, there are so many stories and novels which are connected with air. I didn't.
Too many.
Too many.
Yeah.
Yes. Because of lackness of air, or because too much air. I didn't think about that until now, listening to you. And I was also surprised that we are talking about flows. And if you think about fluidity is finally a notion which comes from another element, which is water. And also we're starting talking about flows instead of starting from water, starting from air. So that was also a question me, because it's like liquid versus flow, something which is first liquid. And then we are talking about in terms of air, in terms of circulation. And also I was talking with a sociologist here about this question of fluidity, and he was saying about water that in different languages, always water has two different dimensions, which is one is flowing and the other one is staying, like stagnant, lakes and seas. So it's surprised that we are talking about flowing in aerial terms. These were just my first reactions. I have many others, but probably there are some questions we can have, or your own reaction to this.
Shall I say something quickly? Yes. And it's about the air within. So I'm sort of trying to discuss the air as a material element, but that this air seems to speak to something within the imagination, and it seems to be a way that we make sense of particular relationships, make sense of difference, make sense of the world that we build around us. But it's sort of, when I began the book, you almost begin, oh my God, how the hell, how do you write about these things that are so, they proliferate everywhere, and also, as you say, air and many other elements are substances that, yes, are held within our imagination, and we think through the elemental, but at the same time, they are things that aren't constant. They change shape and they change state and form, but they really matter. And one of the although I didn't really know that I was going to get there when I started this project, I've started then being involved in other writers and scholars who are also, there's lots of other people who are writing about air water and earth and other materials. And one of the kind of issues that is got at is sort of how we understand the actual material properties of an element like air or water doesn't just matter for us for scientists attempting to understand the composition of these and processes of these forms, but they matter in the social, political world too. So I'm working with a group of political geographers who are interested in territory, and they're interested in forms of territory that don't subscribe to our legal definitions about them. So like ice. So defining ice as a territorial space is quite difficult because it can shift state depending on where we're talking about in the world. The kind of people I've been working with are looking at ice in parts of northern Canada and elsewhere, where ice is engaged with as a liquid and as a solid material. But the kinds of terms that are used to define those spaces, especially at the edges of territory, don't subscribe to our sort of legal technologies that we use to do that, because the state of these objects shifts and changes according to the climate and the weather conditions. But also, we relate to these materials very differently. So the Inuit Declaration on Sovereignty is an explicit description of very different kinds of encounter with the material world that states aren't very good at understanding, and certainly the international sphere is not very good at making sense of. So that's one thing. And the other sort of really quick thing to say is, what I was trying to sort of tease out, and what the book tries to tease out, is a sort of where are we in relation to the air or relation to other kinds of elements. And I think sort of one thing we've been talking about is the air as something that we're sort of shaped by, and the air that we exude, and we release air and do other things. We interact with air. We might see the atmosphere as a product of our relations. But there's also that we might also want to work harder, and where literature might really help us is an encounter with the elements that is not so close to us. So some of the relationships with air I was talking about today are kind of quite intimate, and they're fluid and they're changeable. But some of the encounters with air I was trying to sort of excavate are quite primordial, and they're apart. It's almost as if these elements are apart from us and have no respect for our agency. They have no respect for our social constructions that we might say or write about them, or the way we might try to designate them. There's something quite exorbitant and recalcitrant about the elemental that I think writing is much better at talking about than other sorts of modes of expression that I've come across, at least. Yeah.
At the same time, there are many disciplines which are involved into this way of perceiving these elements. We were sitting here, Bruno Latour from Paris, and he's a sociologist, anthropologist, and we were talking a lot about air, and someone said, well, probably if we talk about air or elements in this theory of Anthropocene and so on, probably we can imagine that there are some disciplines which are not involved in this thinking. Like, for example, someone say theology is not involved in it. And I say, well, I work with climatologists, geographists, and I can say that I can also talk with theologists, and we are all together thinking about CO2, even from with the theologist's point of view. So everyone is really involved into it.
Yeah, that interdisciplinarity is so important, and where I was sort of trying to say that the science of the material really does matter. It matters quite intimately. Some of the people I'm thinking about are, as they're trying to make sense of different kinds of apprehensions of territory, they're working with meteorologists, or they're working with hydrologists, because they too are grappling with the indeterminacy of matter. There are qualities of water that we don't yet understand, or they perform in certain conditions in ways that we understand, but in others they don't. And so, I think part of social science and the arts and humanities engagement with that world is often quite a distant one. But I think you're seeing examples of those disciplines kind of coming together. I mean, Latour was just involved in that Monument to the Anthropocene sort of project, where had a very tiny involvement in. I wasn't there, but Thomas Saraceno launched his solar balloon, and so we were sort of writing little bits for it. So I wrote a little bit on levitation for it. So it's sort of that alongside in some respects, the project is quite a technical project, understanding how we can build these forms of movement just with the power of the sun. So sort of the interaction between these different disciplines and practices.
He's talking about an Argentinian artist whose name is Thomas Saraceno. We wanted to invite him this year, but unfortunately he was very busy, so he couldn't come. And he has many artistic projects like Cloud City, about flows, fluidity, and people in the air. And Don Latour was making paper on all his work. Unfortunately, we cannot receive him. So you were also involved in this project.
So they collated a series of writings that they I thought was going to form part of the balloon. So I found it possibly more exciting than I should have done. But in the end, that's not how it turned out. We still ended up presenting these writings that then formed part of the exhibition. Yeah. There was one more thing I wanted to say. I don't want to gabble on for too long, but there's also, thinking about trying to take the elemental seriously, and there are philosophers of the elemental. John Sallis is someone I've been reading a lot. There's also a danger in doing it, and especially within my own discipline has almost gone through an elemental turn, sort of 100 years ago, where human geography thought about the elements much more seriously than we do now, but almost thought about them in deterministic ways. So sort of geography went through a period, through what it calls now environmental determinism, where it sort of assumed that races, societies were being governed by the elements. So so what I'm suggesting is that, or I'm nodding to, is that there were a lot of dangers in doing that, and there were efforts to understand the geopolitical map of Europe according to that kind of those sorts of assumptions within different quite influential geographic schools, particularly in Britain and elsewhere, which have since been heavily criticised. But I think part of what we're talking about is there's still something in that kind of work that could be recovered, but with a lot of care, I think.
Okay, so are there any questions about the speech today or the text? Some people read, because we prepared some questions.
I have some questions about your conference. I have two questions and they are linked in my head. So, first of all, could we say that there's maybe a paradox that the biggest levitator ever is living without air? I'm thinking about the movie Gravity, by example. These people are gravitator, but there is no air, I think. And my second question is, you've been talking about all these levitators in the past, like witch, ghost, and I think in a Western viewpoint, these things are more or less or definitely not human. And so becoming a levitator, does it mean always being something always more than human? And so our trend to levitate today, is it a trend to become more than human? But I'm...
Do you prefer to answer immediately, or do you want to do some other
Can I come to
similar questions?
Okay.
As you like.
Can I quickly come back to the last part of the question, because I feel like I can speak towards that, and maybe I can get back to the first part at another point. Thank you for those questions. I mean, they're really thought-provoking. So the modern human question, I think, is fascinating. I think, and so I mean, the last part of what I presented, I suppose, is the start of the levitation project. So I'm trying to get back to your first question, I suppose, I'm trying to think about, what is the relationship between levitation and air, and can we have levitation without air? And I think those are great questions, and there's lots of examples of things being levitated by, but they're not their relationship to gravity is different, and their relationship to air is different. So that relation, I think, really needs to be teased out. It's a fascinating one. Maybe we can come back to that. But with your first question, it's sort of, I think some of the levitation I'm interested in don't have to be human at all. So I'm quite interested in the relation between levitation, or levitation as some form of. It's difficult to talk about because I haven't really had the time to think about it for very long. But the relationship between levitation and forms of resistance or protest, but those aren't quite the right words, or sort of levitation as a kind of transgression. And so there's an odd relationship with will that I'll come back to in a minute, because I think it relates to the point about more than human. But some of the examples and events that I'm struck by are efforts to levitate things, even if the levitation will never happen. In that, raising something is like that becomes impossible. But it's the very act which is transgressive. So one of the big examples that I'm trying to sort of delve into for the book is a peace march on the Pentagon in Washington in the 70s, led by Abby Hoffman, where a group of peace activists circled the Pentagon and tried to raise it. But they were chanting, they made an official request to the Pentagon. The rumour is that the Pentagon wrote back to them and said, yes, we give you permission to raise the building, but only by 5 feet. But the act itself of encircling the Pentagon and the organised crowd was what was transgressive, and the badges that they created, and the movement around it, and the stories and narratives around it. So some of the examples I'm interested in don't have to be human at all to do it. But the sort of question around, I think there's lots of ways of thinking about the more than human, which I think is really, really inspiring. And let me think about it in 2 ways. So some of the kinds of levitators that are interesting get back to that question of will. So levitation as this kind of transgressive, maybe sort of resistive force can be thought of as a kind of submissiveness or a passivity of the body. And one might think, however we qualify that, is the question. But a lot of the levitators I'm thinking about are levitated without outside of their will or force. So some of the historical work that I'm doing is looking into effectively Catholic saints and their angels and those sorts of myths, and their history and the sort of the realism with which we can look at the historiographies and hagiographies of their work. I think it's absolutely fascinating. But what it assumes is effectively in some of the cases, what it assumes is a kind of ecstatic experience of spiritual possession, where the subject moves outside of themselves. And they are filled with a kind of spirit, which is almost our definitions of ecstasy. Say Saint Teresa in Ecstasy, Bernini's famous sculpture, is Teresa levitating. She's able to look back at herself and witness herself in this ecstatic state, being possessed by some kind of presence. So is that? I mean, to me, that's more being more than human. That's being something else, being possessed by something much, much more. And there's lots of ways that we can talk about the subject and the body as a container and everything else. I mean, the history of levitated saints is fascinating, and particularly, I think one of the stories I've been trying to tell through this is the different kinds of genderings of the ways that we inhabit air, or the ways that we become levitators, and Teresa and others kind of stand out. Teresa in particular, because she became so public and became so popular, and her writing and work became so notable, whilst others were entirely unaware of their experience, but then received almost kind of cult status, whilst others were laughed. And behind all of that are various truth claims about the levitator, and the way those truth claims and different kind of regimes of truth circulate around the levitator. So if you look at the way that the levitations were proved and sainthood or beatification, those processes occurred. In some of my quite partial understanding of that history, levitations had to be proved, and they were proved through testimony, and they were judged by courts. So there is a sort of if the levitator could be more than human, it's the levitator is more than human requires a collective to determine that the levitation ever occurred. So some levitations require a kind of consensus of the events happening in the first place. So I think there's very interesting things going on there that your question's making me think about. And the other thing that I wanted to just mention is the relationship with our political, theological understandings of kingship, where some really rich manifestations of levitations, well, not quite levitations, but aboveness come through. So one of the areas of work that I've been interested in pursuing are quite early medieval, Middle Ages doctrines around sovereignty and around where our sovereign is. And the sovereign is somewhere, is drawing on these early theological devices of perhaps a disappearing Christ ascending or descending, sitting somehow above, maybe in some kind of exceptional space outside but inside of our laws, however you think about that.
So at the beginning it wasn't magic.
Yeah.
It was political.
It was, yeah, potentially, yeah. I kind of be careful because there are then older myths, shamanic myths of levitators too that we can think about as well, that I'm trying to get access to. But yeah, I mean that's a really crucial question, and thank you. Yeah.
Maybe it's not questions, but it's ideas. There are two ideas that came to my mind while listening to the conference. The first one is about air and the atmosphere it creates. And I'm thinking about the tropic, because when I'm from Colombia, and the Latin American literature around 1970s and 1960s, there are a movement called realismo mágico, magic realism, and real maravilloso, it's very close. And it's how the air, how the atmosphere in the coast, in the hot weather, in the tropic, it's different. And it allows a certain phenomenon happening. And I can, for example, think about Alejo Carpentier and Macandal. That is a character, a black character, that is a slave, who somehow can control the elements and how the air kind of pushes him up and he can almost levitate, but because in this atmosphere in the tropic, it's some sort of magic atmosphere.
Okay.
And Gabriel Garcia Marquez in 100 Years of Solitude, when he talks about the cold air in the mountain, it's not refreshing, it's not healing, it's kind of dead. Yeah. Because life is in the hot weather, in the hot air of the coast. And there is a character that is called Fernanda, and she's from Bogota, she's from the mountains of Colombia. And he says that she lives in some sort of a castle that is very dark, and she moves around with this big, how do you say, these big boxes with things inside, and because she's from the cold weather. She's from the cold air. So that the conference brings to my mind a lot of relations in Latin American literature of how the air is makes the atmosphere and makes the phenomenon occur. And the other idea that came to my mind about Nietzsche, and how Nietzsche talks about the healing air and how the thinking must occur in an atmosphere that allows it. He's sick at the moment, and I can remember that when he's writing Daybreak, that he's really sick, he had to leave the university, so a friend invites him, I think, to Genova, And he writes in Aurora, in Daybreak, how thinking must be some sort of diet, a physical diet. And all of the relation with the vertical, how he says that the human body and all that is human, all to human, is heavy. And how philosophical tradition has tried to make it as almost ethereal, yes, like a smoke. And he talks about sublimation and how the solid becomes almost like a vapor. And no, thinking must be a diet, not vertical relation, but here in the ground, not in the skyscrapers in that sense, not for the air people, but for the earth, ground people. And I was thinking about Teresa in the unbearable lightness of the being. Yes. She says, I don't want to be light, I want to be heavy here. So the things, the ideas about Nietzsche, how we shouldn't be air people, but earth people, ground people, and not sustain a vertical relation with ourselves, like almost on the horizontal, the word. But it was two ideas to bring to, so that they came to my mind.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think sort of the questions around the tropics, I mean, are really fascinating. I mean, they do. I think the kinds of apprehensions of air in the material imagination that I've been describing are quite positioned, and I've tried to flag that up at the beginning. I think that where it's pretty obvious that these are coming from a particular Northern European tradition, or one that is sort of looking out and travelling to, I think, more than anything. And so it's interesting that they can be subverted so much just within those parallel stories from the tropics. And I think that what's interesting then is the reverse through the kind of the colonial apprehension of the tropics then almost then reverses that very story. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the ways that some of the cotton mills that I was describing, both in perhaps Lancashire or even in Mumbai, were talked about in terms of producing a kind of tropical air, but that tropical air was sort of dangerous and unwholesome. In fact, it was understood to bring premature adolescence among the workers within the factory. So you can think about the kind of tropes of the kind of colonial apprehensions of the tropics that are being brought there, really problematically. But yeah, you're right to say that there are other kinds of stories of air going on here that I haven't brought about and talked about, that are utterly fascinating. And makes me think that I really should be exploring them. So thanks for that. And then the second question around Nietzsche, I guess, I think you're right. You can see that there is a sort of shift in thinking around, at least around some of the excerpts that I was drawing on. But at the same time, I think through the sort of emphasis on elevation and sort of a healthy kind of thinking and a healthy sort of atmosphere, I would be careful in suggesting that the sort of air thoughts that I was trying to excavate was a sort of a kind of passive thought, or sort of bit weightless and being above and not requiring effort or the force of the body. So it's not. In other words, I don't think the passages of Nietzsche that I was drawing on, I don't think they necessarily imply weightlessness. And I think that it was still an active, motion-filled thinking that he was prescribing. It's just, but I guess where we're differing is sort of through those two passages, or through the passages that we're both, you and I, are thinking through, is the environment in which that thought, that thinking, feeling is being done, and it's a kind of muscular thought. I don't know if that's compared in the kind of writing that you're thinking about. And it seems to me to be about the kind of thinking that is heavily physical and isn't involving immobility of the body in any kind of form at all. It's not perched on top of a mountain; it's climbing it, and it's feeling the elements on one, on the face, and of the strain and exertion of the body. So it's quite an active, muscular kind of thought that's going on here, and maybe that shares a comparison with this other writings. Yeah, thank you.
I had another question about meditation. Because first I thought about it as freedom, because there is no more limits in this space, and then I thought about ghosts, and I was wondering, is only the air more like a trap? Because it creates a sort of distance and disconnects from the rest of the world. So I thought maybe the air is more a prison than a freedom.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, it's quite a big question. I think that, I guess a lot of the explorations of air that I was describing, until I got to the kind of explicitly levitation part of the talk, see air in the ways, so the narrative I was telling, I suppose, is the ways in which air has been fortified, bound up, separated, purified, distilled. Just entirely technologically managed. And in which case, the story seems to be one of isolation, insulation, separation, etc. So the story is one of imprisonment, both for the air people, perhaps, who don't want to leave their cocoon, at least within this literature, and then the inability of those below who may or may not want to get at it. One thing I guess I need to be careful about in the way I'm describing this narrative is that I need to be careful not to sort of gets back to the idea of the air and the elemental, in the sense that there is what's emphasised within some of the literature is not an entire over-determination of the ability to manage the air. So in other words, there is still something kind of quite excessive about these abilities to separate oneself. And so even within our American psycho, Patrick Bateman, those moments of separation are kind of broken, and this perfect isolation or insulation is never entirely works. I mean, in the wider book, I don't think it's in the excerpt I sent you, I look at biosphere too. And there's lots of, I mean, I don't need to write it, lots of other writers have written about Biosphere 2 as a kind of perfect example of attempting to create a perfect second home, but in the end our ability, because of the things that we understand about air being actually, and the ways in which we relate to it, and the way in which organisms create a kind of ecosystem, are still relatively limited. There is only so much we can do to actually engineer our environments, engineer our worlds. There's, agency only goes so far, and the material, inorganic, organic agency of the world, the environment, may well disrupt our plans. So the kind of, I guess what I'm saying is that the kind of imprisonment of air is qualified in the sense that it often fails, or there are breaks, seepages, disruptions to those very plans, so that they might not work. And then with the thinking about the levitator then in relation to this question of imprisonment, one of the reasons why I first got interested in the levitator is that it seemed to be a story of escape, or of leaving behind some kind of earthly pull. But I think the more I get into it, the more I'm struck by the levitator is not necessarily that willful, and if they are, it's a story of struggle, toil and effort, politics. So to equate levitation with freedom is something I'm very eager to try to sort of contest or to avoid, because or at least the stories that appeal to me about levitation are incredibly unequal, and they tell actually quite interesting stories of struggle that need to be told. Even if the levitator seems like the superfluous kind of why am I looking at levitator? Well, I think that there are. It's interesting. Yes, on its own right, but I think that that it gets us to other kinds of critical stories about this phenomenon that are interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Don't you see that maybe one of the problems European culture, Western culture has with air is that it's something you don't see. It's something around you, and I think one of the main problems in our culture is with air is the link it has with death. And I've been studying Holocaust literature, and it's very amazing how very few books can treat about gas. And gas for Europe, Western world in the 20th century is a major element. Not only because of World War I, with the gas in the battlefield, but also, of course, in the gas chambers. Yeah. And for example, I've been studying Elie Wiesel's books. His main book about Holocaust, we say in English, we don't use this word anymore in French. Holocaust is linked to flame, and not to gas. But in this book, The Night, to never make mention of gas chamber. Never. If you read this book, and if it's the only reference you have about Holocaust, you get out of this lecture sure that the Nazis killed the Jews within a crematorium. There's not a single mention of gas.
Yeah.
And also, I'm sorry, give you all my thoughts. But it is linked to death, but it is linked to life too, because as we don't see it, but we will not be able to speak or to sing without air. Words and music is air.
Yeah. There's a great, I don't know if you've heard the phrase, words frozen on northern air. I don't know if that's, Benjamin Franklin uses that in a letter. He writes about his letters that were following him were stuck and for 2 years or something, and so he says they were like words frozen on northern air. But it comes from a passage from Northern Exploration where they were experiencing conditions where it became so cold they believed that their words were being frozen, or that the sound waves were being frozen. I don't know quite what they thought, but that interaction is really enticing. But your question was sort of about the invisibility of the air, and I mean, I guess most of us have a kind of curiosity with the examples that you're drawing on. I mean, it does make me think about approaches that I don't necessarily take, but I'm quite struck by, that sort of look at the way that so some of the examples that you're drawing on, like the use of cyclone gas during the Holocaust, or the use of gas at Ypres, or in terms of gassing soldiers during World War One. That those sorts of, if you well, something I've got interested in, at least. I'm not explaining this very well at all. I'm mumbling now. But when I've sort of looked at work that has looked at the kind of sort of political economy of the industries that produce those very substances, you start getting taken to a different sort of visual culture around the air and gas that maybe isn't present within some of the Holocaust memoirs that we might draw on, or at least the one that you drew on there. So I'm thinking of, I don't know if you come across Esther Leslie's work on aesthetics and colour, and she sort of she looks at the German chemical industry that was producing both gas, but also it was producing the ability to to actually produce colour and produce photographic images. And what she's sort of doing is sort of timing the ability to take the air away from people, which effectively was kind of what gassing is doing in that, or you're producing. I mean, so I don't know how much we sort of go believe Sloterdijk, but Sloterdijk, you've talked about that. So Sloterdijk sort of says that, you know, gassing is creating an environment within which we can't exist, or you're not quite taking the air away, but you're taking breathable air away. So you're sort of removing the biological environment from us. But sort of Leslie's parallel history to that is that at the same time, or that was made possible by a form of social, political and industrial production that was making the ability to visualise those events possible, even if they weren't captured on film. So there's somehow a kind of burgeoning ability to make visible things through film, etc., that this chemical industry is producing, whilst at the same time its counter effect is to take the air away. And there's just something about that to me seems intriguing. I don't know where else to go with it, but that is part of what your question. That's how your question spoke to me. I mean, I think the other way, but the other way that one could think through your question is sort of, gas can't be seen, but does it get seen through its effects? So we don't see gas, but so we see its consequences. And maybe the smoke, or the human smoke that you draw on in the writing is then one of the maybe that's the consequence of the crematorium, but it's also the consequence of gassing. I don't know. I'm just thinking, are there sort of traces of gas that are? I mean, famously, some of the historians and the revisionists and the deniers were looking at holes, weren't they, within the gas chambers? Because they were trying to prove the existence of being able to supply gas to the gas chambers. And so sort of the early denial debate circulated about whether the holes existed in the chambers to supply the gas. And so there's is there a kind of tracing around this thing that you can't see? So inquiry has turned to look for the infrastructure, or we look for the signs in the smoke that maybe turns up in writing, or we look for in the record within film that is. And there's a recent film that was launched in London a few months ago, where they I can't remember which extermination camp they were exploring, but where then the trace becomes the mounds of bodies and clothing, etc. So is that one way that we get to the air, or the absence of a visual register of gas in those moments, that we actually turn to its traces, or to the infrastructure? I'm not sure. It's provocative.
I have one question. We spoke about the disappearance of forms in the air and the effect body or movement produce in the atmosphere, but what's your interpretation of the place you give to the aura in your study? Is it related to the atmosphere, the relation between air and invisibility of air? So I'd like to see.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's really interesting. I've only really thought about it in one way, I suppose. So, in my interpretation of aura and atmosphere, and I'm slipping, in the talk, I was slipping kind of quite strategically from my point of view between air and atmosphere, and there are quite a lot of writings around atmosphere as affect that I'm quite taken by. So I do think that atmosphere is more than the material qualities of air. I think that it's a kind of in between, both exuded from bodies. I think it's acting on bodies. I think it's somewhere within the kind of continuum of where we might isolate emotions and affects and instincts and other sort of bodily reactions. It's also, I also think it's something that we construct through the imagination and we write about it. Aura, to me, seems quite close to some of the ways that we might think about affective atmospheres, but through my sort of Benjamin reading of Aura, then I'm using it in quite a specific way. So, at least in the context of the travel logs of Cairo that I was drawing on, Aura is an atmosphere that has lost its charm, or it's an aura that has lost its gloss or glint, if you like. So it's an aura that is reproduced. It's a atmosphere that we've experienced before, that is being repeated, been encountered numerous times. It's been transported. It's been copied over and over again, which again, gets us back into Benjamin. So it's sort of atmosphere, I mean, there's a lot of discussion, do we walk into a room and experience an atmosphere? So does an atmosphere precede us? Do we, sorry? Like an ambience. And the debates around atmospheres, affective atmospheres and ambiences and airs, again, is something that we could talk for quite some time about. Or do we co-produce those sorts of those ambiences or atmospheres? Is an ambience or an atmosphere a kind of quality of an air, or is it something else? So, but anyway, to me at least, in the kind of Benjamin reading of atmosphere or aura, there's something tarnished about it. But importantly, there's something very mobile about it. So there's something about atmosphere that within some of the reading, and if you look at the sort of family relationship to the way that geographers have written about ideas of place or senses of place, there's something quite specific about atmospheres that seem kind of rooted or embedded within particular circumstances and places, where sort of aura, at least in this depleted aura sense, is moved and it's been but it's not quite what you expected, or there's been too many renderings of what an Oriental atmosphere is or air is, and so when it's encountered, one's disappointed. So sort of the repetition and circuits of mobility seem to me to be tied up in those ideas.
I have another question about this giving shape to air, coming back to Rotterdam, and when he talks about a child who's making soap balloons, and so the balloon is like a way of making an object with air. I was also thinking about paper planes, about the last movie, When the Wind Rises, Miyazaki, from Bears, of course, already, and I was thinking that in that movie, which is a movie full of apocalyptic moments in Japan, earthquakes, and so on. There, I think the wind, because Valérie is le vent se lève, il faut tenter de vivre. The wind rises, you have to go towards life. So air is like movement towards life, against, to go behind apocalyptic moments. So you talk about moral qualities of air. Do you think that today, in the 21st century, when we are all flying, we can fly, do our relationship to air really changed? Is it still full of moral qualities, or is more technologies? Like, for example, everyone today has documents in the clouds. Okay, so I think we have the cloud is a real icon for us today, and it's also a way of storing materials, information. So can we still attach moral qualities to air and to representation of air like the cloud can do? Because at the same time, we are, like Michel says, we are angels.
Yeah.
Because we fly.
Yeah.
And you can imagine that the flying assistant, just to come back to the gender question, what does the lab, is a representation of levitation in the air, accompanied with this gender, sexual projections.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so big.
You can not answer.
Yeah. There's so many different answers. I kind of think, okay, yes and no. So so I can kind of see that there's around the kind of area that, to a certain extent, you and I are kind of both interested in, right? At least around, if we're partly talking about kind of airports and aviation, in that kind of a relationship with the air, I think you could see that there's certain lots of novelty and excitement and sense of life.
Yes.
So academics have a tendency to sort of have written about aeromobilities as so one of John Arry's really fundamental arguments about mobility is that mobility is what constitutes the social, and without mobility there can be no social. So and we might say about the political and everything else as well. So if we then think about that argument in relation to aeromobility and air travel and airports, then we could, there's a tendency to think about aviation as a very uneven but integral sort of form of modern existence, and we perform all kinds of social obligations and contracts and relationships through travel in that kind of way. But to think about it as sort of life is tricky, because, or at least some of the narratives that we could explore within those kinds of literature and more popular kinds of commentators on air mobility is that it has become everyday and routine and part of our banal existence. So writers like Auger and others who we were talking about earlier, whether we agree with them or not, kind of talk about the normality, at least to some people, that that form of mobility is taken. And so it's difficult to deny that there's something in that, despite the way you might have problems with the way that writers like Auger go about it. And it's difficult to deny that there's been a certain kind of loss of excitement, prestige and glamour, and something vital even. I mean, maybe something vital about the air hasn't been there since the very early days of air mobility, of flight, because of the way it's been consumerised. It's been sort of liberated from nation-state projects to a certain extent. We have these international airlines, we have these ginormous airports, we have low-cost airlines. Our intimacy with aircraft has perhaps been gone, although you could argue that low-cost travel brings that back. But before I went on an EasyJet flight, I don't think I'd stepped on the airport tarmac. I don't think I'd stepped on the apron. I don't think I felt the blast, the heat of an engine until then, which recalls something of at least a kind of intimate, vital relation with aircraft, that kind of flight at least. So one answer would be that through all of this, has that gone?
Gone with the wind.
Gone with the wind, yeah. But then on the other hand, I witnessed in front of where I live, somebody flying a kite a few weeks ago, and somebody launching a bottle. So if you fill up a bottle with water and then attach it to a bicycle pump, I don't know if you did this when you were children. Yeah, maybe it's a good experiment for this class. You can fire a rocket of water quite high in the air, and there is something incredibly magical about. I mean, maybe this is a bit. I don't know. Maybe this is. I can only look at that through the crystal of contemporary cinema and everything else that I've been exposed to. But when Mary Poppins at the end flying the kite, there's something joyful about that quite different relationship to the air, where the wind rises the kite and where the bottle forces its way into the air. So there is still something about sending things into the air that where you are then subject to
the relationship with space.
What do you send? Yes, yeah.
Out of the air.
Yeah, and landing on the comet. There's still something big about air and about maybe beyond that planet that still somehow enlivens something. I mean, it's difficult. Yeah, I'm kind of in danger of being far too general about this. But
sort of instinctively, I feel like that there's something more to be said about about those other sorts of apprehensions there that we engage with that may or may not be routine anymore, that tell us something about a desire to be aloft or a desire for that kind of sensation. Yeah.
So we're still angels.
Yeah.
Okay, I think time is over. Game over.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think it was a very good beginning to establish the framework of we're going to go on with this topic. We hope to receive you once again in a way or another here in Louvain for probably a longer some days.
I'll bring some kites with me.
Yes, please. To fly all together in this grey sky. Anyway. I would also like to thank you everyone and just say a last word to remind our next seminar. It will be in December the 11th, okay, here, on flows of information in social media. Okay, so we have another approach.